Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the implementation of lung cancer screening in Europe after the Nelson trial. Actually, the webinar was intended to be with Professor Harry de Koning, the lead author of the Nelson trial, who unfortunately got sick in a way that he cannot participate in this webinar today. He's on his path to recovery, and we definitely wish him all the best for this. And even though it's sad that he cannot participate, we're very happy to have Professors Caroline van der Aalst and Kevin ten Haaf here today with us. They are both from the Department of Public Health at Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, and they are in Harry de Koning's team. They have already participated in the Nelson trial and are now actively participating in the Lung Ram trial. And Kevin ten Haaf is going to give us, in the first part of the webinar, an introduction to lung cancer screening modeling, and then Caroline van der Aalst will present about the clinical implementation status of the trial. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation, and Kevin, who is going to start, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So good. Good day or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're from. So as Professor Eichner said, myself and my colleague Caroline will basically talk you towards this webinar, implementation of lung cancer screening in Europe after the Nelson trial. And to first give a brief overview of lung cancer in Europe, currently about 28% of all cancer deaths in Europe are related to lung cancer. So that's almost 340,000 deaths annually across the European Union. And the 5-year survival rate of clinically detected lung cancer is quite poor. It's 17 to 21%. And to put this into perspective, in the graph here, you see both the yearly incidence and mortality rates for lung cancer, breast cancer, colorectal, and cervical cancer side by side. And of course, for breast, colorectal, and cervical cancer, there are already screening programs in place in a lot of the countries in the EU. And if we take a look at the incidences of the different cancers, lung cancer is fairly comparable in incidence compared to breast cancer and colorectal cancer. But if you take at the mortality rate of lung cancer, the number of deaths attributable to lung cancer in the EU is almost the same as breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and cervical cancer combined. So lung cancer, although smoking rates are decreasing, is still a very relevant public health problem in the EU. So if we take a look at lung cancer, part of the reason why mortality is so high is because 70% of all lung cancer diagnoses already occurs at an advanced stage, so stage 4, when the cancer has already metastasized. However, the survival rate is much higher when lung cancer is detected at an early stage, because while the 5-year survival of lung cancer diagnosed at stage 4 is only 3%, it's 60% if it's diagnosed at stage 1. So this is part of the reason why lung cancer screening was investigated. And the investigations regarding lung cancer screening already started about 50 years ago in the 1970s, when there were early trials with radiography screening that simply did not turn out to show beneficial effects. However, with the advent of low-dose computed tomography screenings in the 1990s, the non-randomized ILCAP trial showed very favorable results regarding early detection. And as a consequence, both the NLST in the United States and the Nelson trial in Europe were launched. And in 2010 to 2019, the NLST demonstrated a 20% reduction in lung cancer-related mortality, while the Nelson trial demonstrated a 26% reduction in lung cancer mortality. And as a consequence, many countries are already investigating the potential of implementing screening. But of course, there is a lot of research remaining regarding the optimal implementation of lung cancer screening programs. For example, how to identify and invite high-risk individuals. Is a screening program cost-effective? And can we do more personalized screening? And my colleague Carlijn van der Aalst will go further into that in the second part of this webinar. Because right now, I will briefly talk you through some of the results from our trial, the Nelson trial, and compare them side by side with the results of the National Lung Screening Trial. So how do the Nelson and NLST trials compare? Well, we can first have a look at the stage distribution of screen-detected cancers. And while in NLST, about 62% of all cancers were detected at stage 1A or 1B, this was 71% in Nelson. And you may be wondering, what may actually drive this difference? Well, in the NLST, people simply looked at the overall size of the nodule in diameter. However, in the Nelson trial, we also evaluated the volume of each nodule and also looked at the nodule volume times between screenings. And as a consequence, we could directly identify which nodules were growing and thus suspicious. And this translates to a difference in sensitivity as well, as shown in this picture. So this picture shows results from our model that we have at our department, the Miscan lung model. And these are yet unpublished results, in part done by my PhD student, which compares the stage-specific sensitivities for 4 different histologies of lung cancer, with the Nelson trial sensitivity estimates in dark blue and the NLST trial sensitivity estimates in light blue. And as you can see, there is a major difference in sensitivity between Nelson and NLST, particularly for adenocarcinoma. For example, in NLST, the average chance to detect an adenocarcinoma would be around 50% at stage 1A. But in the Nelson trial, this was over 70%. And as a consequence, this of course led to a much more favorable stage distribution in Nelson compared to NLST. And of course, a difference in sensitivity and stage distribution also leads to a difference in mortality. So on the left, you see the long-term results of the, or the short-term results of the NLST. And after about 6 years, the NLST showed a 20% reduction for CT screening compared to chest radiography screening. While in the Nelson trial, after 10 years, we found a 26% reduction in lung cancer mortality compared to no screening. And this is even more interesting if we look at the results side by side. So this table shows the lung cancer mortality rate ratios standardized by year for Nelson and NLST. And if you look at males versus females in Nelson, we see that while the mortality reduction in males was about 24%, this was almost 60% in women in Nelson. Compared to NLST, only an 8% reduction in mortality for males was found, and a 27% reduction in females. However, it's also important to realize that the eligibility criteria in Nelson were broader than NLST. So if we look at the subgroup of NLST eligibles in Nelson, we can see that there is still a more favorable reduction in Nelson compared to NLST. And in particular, of course, the difference between men and women should be noted. So as a consequence, in 2013, due to the results from the NLST, the United States Preventive Services Task Force recommended screening individuals between the ages of 55 and 80 who smoked at least 30 pack years of smoking and were currently smoking or quit less than 15 years ago. And recently, in 2021, the USPSTF expanded their criteria. So they expanded the age range from 55 to 50 and lowered the number of pack years from 30 to 20. So this is, of course, quite a big range to screen people over and quite broad eligibility criteria. But even so, these are still quite in line with what we see in other cancers. So this slide shows a comparison between the 2013 and 2021 guidelines. And you can see the 2013 guidelines on the top line of this table and the 2021 guidelines on the bottom half of this table. And we can see that the number of screenings almost doubled by expanding these criteria from around 230,000 per 100,000 individuals to 419,000 per 100,000 individuals. Of course, given that the eligibility criteria expanded, the number of lung cancer deaths also increased from 381 per 100,000 to 503 prevented deaths. But of course, the proportional increase in CT screens didn't lead to a proportional increase in number of lung cancer deaths averted. So the number of low-dose CT screenings per lung cancer death averted increased from around 600 to 833. Now, these seem like relatively large numbers, but if you compare these to the numbers for colorectal cancer screening and breast cancer screening in the US, we can actually see that the number of screens required is only a bit more than colorectal cancer screening, which requires almost 350,000 screens, and far fewer than required for breast cancer screening, which requires over 1.1 million screens per 100,000. And if we take a look at the number of deaths prevented, with the new criteria, the number of deaths prevented is also somewhat in between the two cancers. So colorectal cancer screening would prevent 700 deaths and require 494 screens per death prevented, while breast cancer screening would prevent 700 deaths, but require 1,519 screens per death prevented. So in that essence, lung cancer may not be as efficient as colorectal cancer screening, but it's still more efficient than breast cancer screening. So the other question is, of course, okay, it is effective, but is it also cost effective? And especially with the expanded criteria, this was something people worried about. And this is a slide that shows the incremental cost effectiveness of the new criteria here in the orange dot compared to the original criteria from 2013. And if we take a look at the number of dollars spent per quality adjusted life year gained, it's still effective if you assume less than $100,000 per quality that you are willing to spend. Now, of course, in Europe, these sort of numbers may not be acceptable for population-based screening programs. So why don't we have a look at another few examples? For instance, quite recently, we performed an analysis for Cancer Australia for the lung cancer screening inquiry. And 3 scenarios were of interest for Cancer Australia, namely screening from 55 to 70, annually requiring 30 pack years and having quit less than 10 years, screening with the PLCO M2012 model at a 1.5% risk threshold, and screening with the PLCO M2012 model at a 1.25% risk threshold, but then not screening annually, but biannually. And if we take a look at the costs per quali gained, we can see that the scenarios above, there we go, cost about $60,000 per quali gained, which, if you translate those to euros, is about $40,000 euros, per quali gained. And right now, the costs per quali are relatively similar between the annual screening scenarios and the biannual screening scenarios. So you may wonder, why not just go for the annual screening scenarios? Well, that is in part due to the number of CT screens required. So here on the left, you see the number of CT screens required per 100,000 for the annual-based scenarios compared to the biannual-based scenarios. And of course, biannual screening almost cuts the number of CT screens required in half. But at the same time, your number of lung cancer deaths averted only decreases by about 25%. So from about 100 to 110 to 71. And what is also of interest is, of course, knowing how long people live after their lung cancer death is prevented. And while you may think this is relatively short, or may just be a moderate life expectancy, we find that per lung cancer death averted, persons live about 9 to 10 years, of which about 8.5 in good health. So lung cancer screening seems to not only prevent mortality, but also does it in a way that allows people to live longer in good health and at a cost-effective manner. Of course, these are analyses for Anglo-Saxon countries, but what about an example closer to home? So very recently, we also evaluated the cost effectiveness of lung cancer screening in Switzerland, which is currently also in preparation. And right now, the favorite scenario is this one, risk 11. And if you compare it to the black dot here, this one represents the 2021 US Preventative Services Task Force criteria. And as you can see, this scenario is quite a bit cheaper than simply implementing the US guidelines. And this scenario would require about 100,000 CT scans per 100,000, but would reduce lung cancer mortality by about 11% on the population level. And individuals would live about 12.8 life years, or about 10 quality-adjusted life years in good health. And overall, this scenario would only cost less than 30,000 euros per quali gained. Now, of course, the question is, what do these costs actually consist of? Well, if we take a look at the same scenario, risk 11, and take a look at how the costs are composed in the initial years since implementation, we can see that most of the costs are due to CT screens and invitations, and the initial care costs for lung cancer patients recently diagnosed. And you can see that compared to no screening, there are quite a few, like the cost for initial care is quite a bit higher. However, there is my mouse. Over time, these costs diminish because you diagnose the largest number of early stage cancers at the beginning of your screening program. And after that, you reach a steady state. Furthermore, after some time, you see that your terminal care costs start to decrease. So from given a implementation in 2023, from 2026 onwards, your terminal care costs would start to decrease as your lung cancer mortality benefit would start to accumulate. And this is definitely of interest given the increasing amount of immunotherapy that is being used. So so in the future, the decrease in terminal care will only become more apparent if a screening program is implemented. So speaking of therapy, if a lung cancer program is implemented, of course, an effective screening program would require effective treatment of these individuals. And this graph shows the treatment received by non-small cell lung cancer by stage in the United States. And what we can see is that the proportion of persons receiving surgery is, of course, the highest for stage 1 cancers, followed maybe some by stage 2. But basically, stage 3 and 4 hardly receive any surgery, but receive mostly radiotherapy and chemotherapy. Now, of course, if a screening program is implemented, we will detect cancers earlier. So the proportion of cancers receiving surgery will increase, while the proportion of cancers receiving radiotherapy or chemotherapy is expected to decrease. So now the question is, how does this actually affect our planned number of surgery capacity? So this graph shows the surgical requirements, radiotherapy requirements, and chemotherapy requirements, and any therapy requirements for 3 different scenarios. And let's focus on the orange one first, which is the 2013 USPSTF criteria. And we can see that with full implementation of a screening program in the US, the required number of surgical resections would increase by almost 37%, while the proportion of cancers receiving radiotherapy and chemotherapy would reduce by about 2 to 5%. Now, on the one hand, this is great, of course, because surgical resection with curative intent is, of course, preferred over palliative radiotherapy or chemotherapy. But it also means that the surgical capacity requirements need to be taken into consideration. And that can be quite a challenge to do, as can be seen in this picture. So the black line here represents the number of surgical treatments required if no screening program is implemented. And the different colored lines represents the surgical capacity required under different scenarios of screening implementation, with, in blue, a 20% adherence to screening, or up to the yellow line, 80% adherence to screening. And we can see that even with a 20% adherence to screening, there's already a considerable increase in treatment capacity. So a proper implementation of a lung cancer screening program also warrants careful consideration of the required treatment capacity. And speaking of implementation, with this, I happily give over the next part of the webinar to my colleague, Carlijn van der Aalst.
Thanks, Kevin. I will start share my screen. And then now I have to. So if it is right, you can see my screen right now. That's right?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay. I will continue with actually also our trial, but let's first start with the current situation of lung cancer screening in Europe. At this moment, there are multiple initiatives about starting pilots, starting local programs. For example, in Croatia, Poland and Italy, there are now a formal commitment for national population screening programs. And the issue here is the role of the GPs in the risk-based identification of the eligible population, and I will come back to that later. In France, for example, is also now a lung cancer screening pilot in which they screen asymptomatic women the next years. Also in Sweden and Germany are the people in an advanced stage of exploring the opportunities for the national implementation of lung cancer screening. And in the UK, some years ago, they started already with some pilots, the Targeted Lung Health Check program. And since 2019, they already started in about 23 locations at this moment. And of course, there's a lot of evidence from all these pilots that we can use. But one other thing that happened last year is that in December, there was a formal statement of the European Union about how to improve cancer screening. And this is a small part of the whole statement, but it stated that there is at this moment strong scientific basis for extending the screening programs to lung cancer. So that is actually maybe the turning point for Europe to further start with more implementation of lung cancer screening and maybe more pilots. But what about lung cancer screening implementation? We need that there are a lot of questions, of course, about how can we implement lung cancer screening, but there are actually what we think 3 main unanswered questions so far that need to be addressed before we can have a widespread implementation of lung cancer screening in Europe. And these are the recruitment strategies. How can we select those who are eligible for lung cancer screening? But also, what about the screening interval? Should we stay with animal screening, or can we also extend the screening interval for some part of the people who will be screened? And of course, when we start screening, then we should also do something with motivating people to quit smoking. And I will tell more about these 3 in the next slides. First of all, the recruitment challenge. Normally, in other cancer screening programs, we used a standard approach, and that's actually a one-size-fits-all perspective in which we send out a lot of information, but that's based on standard materials, standard text. And one characteristics of these materials are that they lack the use of more tailored health messages. But what we know from lung cancer screening is that a lot of people who are eligible for lung cancer screening are also the people who are more likely to have insufficient literacy. And the question then is this one-size-fits-all perspective fair? Because we think that it disadvantages those who actually are more likely not to participate in such healthcare interventions, so that we may unintentionally increase the socioeconomic differences by ignoring the need for tailored health messages. In the lung screening uptake trial, the researchers tried to improve the uptake, and although they not find an improved uptake by using a targeted invitation strategy to the hard-to-reach group, and this was by means of, for example, calling people, the uptake was still about 50 to 53%. And when we compare the uptake of this people who are living in more deprived areas, then an uptake of 50 to 53% is actually not that bad. In the summit trial, they also used more intensive recruitment methods to reach this population. And what we know is that it might be workable, but it needs more attention to further tailor the information for this high-risk population. And it's not only to inform people who are eligible, but we have also to inform people who are not eligible, and we have to explain why they are not eligible. And that, for example, when they are just below of the cutoff, that they are still maybe at high risk for developing lung cancer, but that they do not reach the cutoff criteria for attending a national program, and that it maybe also in some years can change. And that's really different from cancer screening programs such as breast cancer screening, where you just invite all people in a certain age category and of a certain gender. We start also our Thorn and Lungren trial, and actually maybe I have to skip this one and come back to this later because I first have to introduce Thorn and Lungren. But I just go further first to Thorn and Lungren so that you also know a little bit more about this trial. Thorn and Lungren, it means towards individually tailored invitation screening intervals and integrated comorbidity reducing strategies in lung cancer screening. And this is the first large-scale multi-centered implementation trial on volume CT lung cancer screening. The primary aim of this trial is to assess the relatively safety of a personalized risk-based, often less intensive screening regime among high-risk individuals. And I will explain this also later, what means a personalized risk-based screening program. The key issues are again, how can we approach the people, and how can we increase the uptake and increase the informed decision making in this specific high-risk population that is hard to reach and hard to inform, and also actually hard to get in a program. But this population are more likely to benefit from such programs. Another issue is that we want to look at the screening intervals, and in line with the Nelson trial, we will use the volume CT lung cancer screening using the three-way results. So we will use a negative result, an indeterminate result, and a positive result. And I will also come back to that later, what it actually means. And what we will do is that we will test in people who have at their baseline CT scan a negative result, whether we can extend annual screening to biannual. So we randomize them to annual screening or biannual screening. And of course, we want to look at how we can integrate comorbidity reducing strategies. And now I will go a little bit back. I'm sorry for the late, maybe again this one. What we actually did is that we approached people in different ways. In the Netherlands, we have 3 methods of mailings. We have a printed version, we have an online version to inform people. But for example, in Germany, we are using the GPs or pulmonologists or other specialists to select people at a high risk. If they think that one of their patients is eligible for lung cancer screening, then they can check it in our data management system. And the system will give an answer whether that person is eligible or not. So they just have to select their risk criteria. And then I will go back to the risk criteria. People can, for example, go online and complete a self-test with the question, am I eligible? and then they do not receive a number or so, but just a kind of a color, and whether they are eligible or not, but we want not to introduce that people will try and try again until they are eligible. But we want to inform them about how likely it is that they will be eligible. It's also no answer about the lung cancer risk. So we want to make a distinction between those things. But then what we reach is that, for example, for the Netherlands, we also have to approach all people in a certain age category, but a lot of people of them are not eligible. And when people see in the self-test that they are completely green, with the message it's very unlikely to be eligible, then we want to stimulate that people will not try to come in a lung cancer screening program, because we think that they will not benefit from such a program. But if people is in an orange or red area, then we have a person who is more likely to benefit from the program. So then you actually want that people come in the program. And which is, for example, for breast cancer screening again, we only ask for age and gender actually, but lung cancer screening is the first cancer screening program actually that have to use a risk-based selection stage, in which we select people based on a risk, and that is based on, for example, the PLCO model about the specific lung cancer risk. Then we will use a lot of questions, and these are examples of the questions that we will use to determine the eligibility to participate. And then based on the model, we have a final score. And when a person reaches the threshold of this lung cancer risk, then a person can be eligible for participation. And of course, what should be the cutoff of the eligibility based on a risk model? There you have the models and so on to decide, okay, when I use this threshold, that means that I can expect so many people with so many expected lung cancers. And then depending on also the opportunities of a country or Europe or whatever, then you have to decide what should be the best cutoff. And of course, there's also a smoking cessation challenge. We know that a lung cancer screening program might be a teachable moment for smoking cessation services. In all lung cancer screening trials, we found that there were higher quit rates in those who were screened as compared to the general population of the same age. But actually, still to date, there's a lack of evidence about how we can combine lung cancer screening with smoking cessation interventions. About half of the people who are eligible for lung cancer screening already quit smoking. So about half of them are still smoking. And one of the things is that these people, about 50 years and older, most of these people have a long-term smoking history, also with a lot of quit smoking attempts. And for this population, it's quite hard to quit smoking. And the question is, how can we use lung cancer screening moments, for example, the invitation letter, the screening itself, but also the screening test results. How can we communicate these aspects of the program well, so that we can motivate people to quit smoking? And we know that these parts of the screening program, as an invitation and undergoing CT screening, that they can motivate people to quit smoking if you use that moment to personalize the risks of smoking for people. So in our trial, we will also try to motivate people, to inform them that there are coaches who can help them. And then also about the screening interval, what we know from the Nelson trial is that the probability of a lung cancer diagnosis is for all screened participants in the 10 years after baseline about 5.1% on average. But when we look at the different screening test results, so negative baseline CT result means that there are no abnormalities that are indicator for lung cancer. An indeterminate baseline CT result means that there are some abnormalities, but about 90% of these will be benign. And in the case of a positive CT screening result, of course, then there is the abnormality is more likely to be lung cancer, and that needs referral to the pulmonologist. And what we see is that this probability for getting a lung cancer diagnosis in the next 10 years is only 3% for the test negatives, and it increased in the test indeterminates to almost 9%. And what we saw is that in the test positives, it was more than 50% already. So that means that we can maybe increase the interval when the baseline screening test results was negative. So because of all these questions that we have, we started for lung run. We selected individuals aged 60 to 79 years with a PLCO risk for the 6 years, lung cancer risk of 2.6% or higher, or a smoking history of more than 35 pack years, and being a current smoker or former smoker who quit smoking 10 years or less ago. And our population is actually the highest risk population and relatively older, but that's based on our power analysis that actually were done by Kevin to answer our research questions. So that's not that we think that these ages are maybe the best ages for our national program. So again, then back to our trial. When we can reach our eligible population, and then we randomize them to group 1 or 2, and we have done this before the first CT scan, actually because of ethical reasons, so that we can inform a participant before the first screening about their randomization outcome. So that has nothing to do with the whole trial, because actually you can also do it after the baseline result, but we think it's better to do it before. Then all participants will receive a CT scan, and then when the result is negative, the next screening rounds depends on the randomization. So in group 1, the next CT scan is on an annual basis, so after 1 year and after 2 years. And in the second group, the participants will receive another CT scan only after 2 years. And of course, when the results will be indeterminate, then a repeat scan after 3 months will follow. And if the result turn out to be positive, then there's a referral to the pulmonologist for further diagnostic workup. So what are we thinking about the potential impact of this risk-based screening program? When we look at, for example, the lung cancer diagnosis, of course, with the risk-based interval screening, what is in our case biannual screening, then you have a little bit a lower lung cancer incidence. So you will detect somewhat less lung cancers as compared to annual screening. But what we see is that when we increase the risk interval, the screening interval, then the overdiagnosis will be comparable, but the advantages are that the number of, for example, biopsies and bronchoscopies for false positives will be much lower. And although we have a little bit decrease in lung cancer mortality reduction, what we will see is that it will prevent comparable lung cancer deaths, but it will save a lot of CT screenings, and it can save up to 70% of the CT scans needed as compared to annual screening. So that is an enormous amount of prevented CT scans. But what do we expect? And I will check the time. Oh, I have to hurry up. When we have the baseline CT scan and for lung run, we have, of course, the 3 outcomes. And when we screen 100 people, then we expect that 82% of these people will have a negative screening test result. About 10 out of these 100 people will have an indeterminate screening result and need, after 3 months, a repeat scan. When they have had a repeat scan, then about 9 out of 10 will have a negative screening test result, a final result, and 1 out of the 10 people with a repeat scan will have a positive final screening test result. And we expect that about 8 out of 100 people will have or will need actually a referral to the pulmonologist for further workup. And we expect that of every 2 people who will be referred to the pulmonologist, 1 person will have a lung cancer. And this is also a little bit an overview when we screen 1,000 scans. And this is actually per week or per year or whatever, just what you want. But this is again actually what I've mentioned, and maybe this is the it's also we just put it in just before starting this webinar. When we have 50 scans per week, then based on a positive predictive value of round 1, and it was in Nelson about 38% in the first screening round. And I should have to note that the positive predictive value will increase in the next screening rounds to about 43-48% in Nelson, and we expect that with the current CT scans and the current nodule management protocol that's updated after Nelson, that we can have even better results. But then when we have 50 scans per week, we think that per week within for lung when we have 33 lung cancers and 53 people without lung cancer in baseline, and this will go to about 50-50 in the next rounds. And more important is that we think that we will have about 65% in stage 1 and about 9% in stage 2, about 20% in stage 3, and only 7% in stage 4. And that's the stage shift that we aimed to reach with lung cancer screening. What's about the lung cancer screening? What we also want to do with the program is, of course, that we close the gap between the socioeconomic status classes. But what's also important is that within for lung run, we also will assess the cardiovascular risk, and we also will assess COPD. So with for lung run, we also want to investigate how we can combine the screening for lung cancer with also screening for cardiovascular disease risk and also for COPD, because of our eligible population for lung cancer screening is most often also the eligible population for cardiovascular disease and COPD. So this was the end of my presentation, and I will go back to the normal Oh, and I have to stop sharing. Yes, then we see each other again. I apologize for my switch to my whole presentation, but it was a little bit a last minute presentation.
Yeah, once again, thank you, Carla and Kevin, for this excellent overview, and also for jumping in at last minute, as you said. And really, it's great to have you here. And so I can say, everybody is welcome to ask any questions in the chat. Now we can discuss them. There was actually one question coming up on the role of AI in lung cancer screening. Whether this has any current role, there is already any impact, or what future potential this might hold. I think
that's a very good question. And at this moment in Voorlangen, we will use a first screening, and that will be the local reader actually at the screening center. And our second reader is AI. And if there is a discrepancy between those readings, then we have a third reading of an experienced radiologist who can look at the CT scan. So yes, we expect that AI will have an important role in lung cancer screening, but we have to further create the evidence about what are the pitfalls, what are the opportunities, and how well it's working. So we want to investigate that also in the Voorlangen trial.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, because I think there's also another question that asked for a specific comment on a specific paper. I have not yet read that paper, but in general, we do see that AI in distinguishing between, let's say, for image analysis, it's very, very promising, and we've seen some very promising results. With regards to prediction of individual risk, AI does seem to have a bit more problems with that. And there's also been some papers in the literature that actually, if you want to predict an individual's risk, in many cases, AI or machine learning is actually not that better or even worse than a simple logistic regression. So my current view on this is that for imaging analyses, it works wonders. For personalized predictions of risk, we would need to see how the future develops. But right now, there have been mixed results. The areas on the curves seem very good, but that's not necessarily the most important thing for a risk prediction model.
There really was a striking gender difference in the lung cancer reduction mortality in the Nelson trial. Maybe can you comment a bit on that, and whether this is something you anticipate in future trial results as well?
Yes, who will answer? Maybe a first answer is also that we, of course, had a huge difference between male and females, but in the Nelson trial, one issue is also that we were underpowered to show lung cancer mortality reduction in females. So that's the reason that we had to focus on males. That was the primary protocol of the Nelson trial, but last minute actually we also included females. But Kevin also did some modeling analysis on that, so maybe you can further extend the answer.
Yes, so that's also one of the last references I posted in the chat, in that we know that there are differences in which sort of types occur between men and women. So women in general seem to develop proportionally more adenocarcinomas compared to men, who develop a bit more squamous cell carcinoma or small cell. However, what we did not expect is that for a given histological type, for a given adenocarcinoma. Generally, the preclinical growth of an adenocarcinoma in women seems to be longer than in men, which translates to, for the same number of CT scans, a higher probability that you detect the adenocarcinoma in an earlier stage. So we suspect that that contributes to, let's say, the better results for women compared to men.
Yeah, and then we have also some other issues, and that is very simple in who will attend the screening program, what's the adherence to follow-up screens, because especially in lung cancer screening, it's also that people can think after baseline scan, okay, I got my CT scan, there were no abnormalities, so yeah, it's not needed to have another CT scan each year or so. So women are more likely to attend these programs compared to men. So, and also in treatment, women have other behavior actually in treatment than in men. So within a screening program, we have to look at the whole range of factors that can influence the outcome of lung cancer screening between the males and females.
There was a question regarding the modified PLCO risk score. Do you think this is still a valid parameter, or are there any improvements required?
So I have to be very careful, because I did see the creator of the PLCO M2012 model in the chat. Professor Tamamagi, please also comment. But as far as we've seen now, the basic PLCO M2012 model by itself already functions quite well. Of course, that's not to say that there may not be a potential for further improvement, especially, let's say, if you have additional information from future screening scans, which Professor Tamamagi also worked on and can also contribute to further estimating risk. It's also the question of when you want to apply the model, because at a certain moment you could put in additional information, but the question is, do you have that available on a, let's say, population level? Or let's say if you have a biomarker available that performs really well, you of course would need to obtain that biomarker for the individual. So it also depends a bit on, would you use this model for initial selection, or would you use an expanded model, given that you already have a lot of clinical data? So that's also a bit of a trade-off, because then using the more expanded model also, of course, means having to get more data, especially if you want to incorporate biomarkers or previous screening results, which you may not have, at least in your hospital system or in a population-based system. So that's maybe a very long answer to say, in short, yes. In practice, it does require additional data gathering.
Okay, there's another question regarding additional markers to integrate into the selection of patients for screening. So maybe can you give, that's of course a very encompassing question, some of your ideas regarding the role of biomarkers or integration of comorbidities which pose an additional risk for further workup of the participants.
Yeah, that's also that there are a lot of studies now also on the use of biomarkers. First, to select people who are at high risk for developing lung cancer, but also when, for example, there's an indeterminate screening test result, who need to have follow-up and who not. So there are a lot of initiatives, but at this moment we do not have a biomarker that is able to help actually. But also in the forward lung trial, we will look at biomarkers that maybe can help in the future. So yes, we are looking at that, but this moment we have no biomarkers so that we can use. What maybe also good is to say is that the recruitment, for example, in the Netherlands, we have to approach people by sending them letters and so on information at home. But for example, in Germany, but also in Spain or so, the selection will be based on specialists who can select people, and then they can use, for example, then a system to check the eligibility criteria. But that way, how to reach people, how to inform them, that's also very important in are you able to select that high risk population that you need for an effective screening program.
Okay, thank you. There are many more interesting questions, but unfortunately our time's up for today. So really on behalf of the ESTS Committee for Learning Affairs, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this webinar, particularly to you, Colin and Kevin. Thanks again for jumping in and really providing such an excellent overview of the current status of lung cancer screening in Europe. And I'd like to invite you all to participate in our next webinar again, which will take place on February 20th. And the topic will be state-of-the-art and novel treatment options with EVLP in lung transplantation. And Marcelo Seipel from Toronto will give us his presentation. So thanks again for participating, and I wish you all a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you.